So one notion that comes through here is that the NFV Mano, as it was defined, is an architecture. It's not a system, and at least I think maybe each one of you touched on it in a little way. We need some kind of standardized NFV Mano light. The orchestration, it needs to be lighter than it is. But to make it lighter, and several of you alluded to this as well, we need to have standard interfaces, a standard way to onboard VNFs, et cetera. What can we do? It seems like people know where we want to go, but I see that carriers are in a rush, and they should be, to get something deployed for two reasons. One, let's get some revenue out of this, but two, we have to learn what we're doing as we go along. And in fact, what it turns out, every year we learn that we don't know everything. But I think the visions of where we need to go are getting more distinct, are more exact. But how do we take, what do you see as the next step? And I'd like to ask each one of you to comment. So Saurabh, you want to start?
Sure. So in terms of what you just mentioned, that's definitely a problem and a challenge. I think two things that we can do in the near term, two very tactical items that don't really stall the deployment and whatever momentum we have while we go through this process of standardization. First is we make sure that we are using standard protocols between various layers. That is essential. I think where the gap is not in terms of there are not protocols available, but there are not enough data models that are standardized. So till that happens, you gotta have standard protocols so that you are set up for that transition as and when it happens. The second is not to leave the problem for somebody else. I mean, one of the things with Etsy is there are lots of boxes, but those are not products. If you say, oh, this function, this is VNFM. This function is NFVO. What am I gonna do? I'm gonna do this little sliver here. That approach may work in the POC, but when you go to a deployment, the end customer is not interested in what the difference between VNFM and VNFO is. It is about the full functionality. So important to provide the full functionality as we offer these platforms that cater to branch services. I think those are two tactical things we gotta do as we build towards these standards and these data models that are somewhat missing at this point in time.
So when you deploy, when you build a complete solution for an operator, you've done a lot of non-standard things. You have to, because not everything's standardized.
That's true.
So that's the big trade-off I see is how do we get towards some kind of standardization versus what has to be today for carriers to get something deployed. They have to choose what's available now and choose a vendor or a couple of vendors to integrate it all.
I won't necessarily call it non-standardized, but in terms of, yes, they are somewhat driven by what are de facto standards. I mean, that's the other flip side if we wait too long for standards. One of the things difference between networking and software has been standard bodies versus de facto standards. If you look at, for example, AWS APIs, that's a de facto standard. So it's fine for those de facto standards to emerge, but as long as we have a way to transition them by using open protocols. So as if we are using BGP amongst the controllers, if there's an attribute that's not standardized, it's easy to move to that. But if you start with using your own homegrown protocol between controllers, then there is no path forward.
Right. Okay. Degu?
Yeah, I would echo many of the things that Sarah mentioned. One thing that I would, of course, recommend that we are observing that directly is the focusing on the business case for that particular deployment. When you focus on that business case, then you're making the decisions in the short term as well as in the long term direction as well. If you use some of the pioneers as examples, Mike, they started when many things were not there. Just there is just like rectangles and circles basically. But it did not stop them, which is the right decision. Of course, they started executing, and they basically said, okay, let me just deploy this first as a maybe discrete function, and then in parallel execute the integration as well. So that's many of the successful companies that in terms of early to market, with customer adoption and all. That's how we have seen they succeed. Waiting for the standards, unfortunately, is taking a little long. And when you're discussing these certain things in these standardization bodies, sometimes you don't know the answers to certain questions. But when you're working on the real problem, the specific problems that that is supported by the business case, that is the very super important piece, in my opinion. It needs to have a business case. Then a lot of things are just supplied to it, fed to it, because there's money involved. And when there's money involved, then there are resources supporting it. So they get resolved. So in a nutshell, my recommendation is don't decrease your speed. Continue on deploying and continue on innovating, but don't stop there. You need to feed the standards bodies as well. We have seen that with EVPN, even we have seen that with other protocols as well, not just necessarily related to the NFV. But if you first innovate it in a different way and bring it back to the standard bodies, then it allows you to converge later. So I think there is a way to achieve that.
Well, it seems like the Tosca and Wang models are an important de facto standard, but defining the services, and then defining what changes in the network and even into the devices need to be made. So really, that standardization of the service description, and then also description of what changes need to go into the actual devices.
Yeah. So it takes a while then.
Gabriele.
Yeah, sure. Maybe controversial. I don't think we are. Yeah. No, I don't think we are close to any standardization. By the way, as a vendor, standards only would help us, because either you are compliant to a standard or it's not the standard you like, then you get out of the business and so forth by that. So even taking away some consideration of VMware, so OpenStack, we run our OpenStack distribution as well. Many of the issues we've seen from a Vim perspective, many carriers have been certifying, testing VNFs on one OpenStack version of a vendor, and then they thought it was done. Then you move to a separate version, then it doesn't work, so it's not a standard. What I'm saying is that it's, my observation is, by the way, we are part of ONUP, we're contributing in ONUP. One of the exciting projects we're working on is the multi-cloud project, how to have not just move from a multi-VIN to multi-cloud, right? Federation of SDN, orchestrator, and so forth. So, but I think we're very far, right? We're part of OSM. So what we see right now is, I think 5G is behind the corner. When I say behind the corner, is 3 to 4 years away, maybe 2, maybe 1, which in telco world it's behind the corner. You can't operate that effectively without virtualization technology. Capacity is running out of space in a physical network, and I see many carriers making decisions that they do not want to add any more physical network. They want to add capacity in virtualized network. So this is causing the fact that you need to grab a solution that works to go to market and make a trade-off.
Yeah. So in fact, carriers don't want standards. They really want interoperability. Yep. And the way you get there is some kind of standard or de facto standard, yeah. Or
but I couldn't need more. Yeah, I couldn't need more with Sarab. Etsy definition. It's very different from 3GPP or definition, so it doesn't solve that problem that you can wire it in that way. So there's always an implementation which is done in different ways.
Danielle.
I guess philosophically, take ridiculously small steps. Now that doesn't necessarily give direct answers. Pico steps. I like your term, Pico. In that, I guess my lens on this is, one, this is kind of now that we move into this new world, kind of a reflection of us as vendors. We haven't done a good job working together in this specific space to try to define some standards. Like my point earlier, that there is definitely a line where things should be standardized. We've done a poor job of doing that. What's I've seen happen, or my vision is, or view is that we've been dragged into, some people have been dragged into some open initiatives because that's ultimately what the providers want. So we need more of a hybrid approach where, yes, we still need to work in this open environment. That's gonna be great, but us as a vendors need to be have a better role in this, and there's things because that thing is done, let's work on the next problem to try to create some innovation and some differentiation. So us as a vendor community need a better job at that and start to embrace that.
Well,
and
one
that does take
example
small
of,
steps.
sorry, any questions pop up now for the, from the audience? Sure. And state your name and organization.
It's Paul from Metaswitch. We've heard a lot today about the need to sort out orchestration for actually putting things in place and standards there. One of the things that we haven't really talked about is what's going to happen to the OSS systems. Yeah. Do we need micro OSS systems, or does the whole monolithic thing that we're used to go away and turn into just a set of REST APIs? Where do we see that headed?
I had 5 questions throughout the morning. OSS is involved here. OSS is involved here. But, that's a pretty big question. And we didn't invite any OSS vendors.
Well, we could just invent a micro OSS and we're done.
I can answer if you want for a little bit. If you don't mind.
Bella.
Okay. Balaji from Ericsson. So I've been working for.
We can't hear you on that.
So Bella from Ericsson. This way,
I don't
without
want
the
to
mic.
take time coming from you guys, but we can talk offline outside.
Yes, there'll be impact on the OSS, obviously. That's what operators are looking at us. So it's up and down the stack. There'll be impact as part of the NFE migration and SDN migration. Yes, OSS is orchestration will be part of that. So there's a tremendous, things are ongoing in the orchestration. I'm going to cover in our panel a lot about OSS and orchestration. Maybe you can join us there. Yeah.
So stick around.
I'll stick around, yeah.
I can perhaps chime in with the
Sure.
analytics view. So what we are observing is since the innovation gives birth to innovation, like for instance when VMware started 15 years ago, created the virtualization world, and then just a lot of the whole industry actually took off from there. So it gave birth to new technologies, new companies, and new ways to solve new problems, etc. So I also see the the OSS, of course, following some very similar trend. And if I just be a little bit more specific, we see the analytics here being very important because now you're collecting a lot of information from the network in the form of applications, users, virtualization infrastructure, traffic performance, and also the general health of the devices or the VMs, etc. So something has to stitch all this information together, and we believe that analytics is playing a very important role there. I cannot come up with any solution, or I cannot give you any suggestions on maybe the fellow over there, Bala, can do a better job than me. And a solution that encompasses very different use cases like mobile, wireline, maybe SD-WAN or something else. That will be a challenging task. But if I look at each and every solution area and each and every use case, we are seeing an acute need for analytics for that use case. That's how I would respond.
Yeah, and just adding on that, by way of background, prior to VMware, I worked in an analytics big data company. I think we saw a change in OSS happening not just because of virtualization, but because of the IP being part of mobile core networks. When you used to collect events, phone management, performance management data, and so forth, now you start to collect flow, right? Analysis, layer 7 data, DPI data, and you start to correlate this in the, the billions of rows, maybe with an instant, less than, 10 milliseconds type of results you need to provide. I think virtualization, I was pointing before, accelerates or makes these things even more complex because a lot of these existing OSS systems, and by the way, there's no one OSS system you work in every carrier, you probably have about 50 to 100 OSS systems around. Then you now start to lose your data sources in a virtualized world. Physical world is still there, but you start to lose all the data sources, and these VNFs are now applications moving around, and now you need to rebuild that. So I think my view is that I think you're correct, whether it's a micro OSS or whether it will be a different breed of OSS, or whether you build it inside or you have information coming from VNF in a closed loop with orchestration. That analysis, that correlation, anomaly, prediction needs to happen, because otherwise you don't have an effective way of managing the networks. And I'm not sure the existing players are evolving fast enough, so there will be opportunity for either rebuilding or looking at new players which would take radical change in terms of how they manage over the course of the years their collection and correlation and analysis of data.
Just maybe to add to that, just a little bit different viewpoint. Well, I love the name microSS, maybe I'll steal it, yeah. But it's not as far as we think, at least based on the perspective we have, based on the SD-WAN deployments with people like BT or Telephonic or Telia that we are undergoing. They are forced to evolve the existing OSS. So there is, it may be called something else. So that sort of data-driven, agile, programmable platform that interfaces with the end customer and brings on-demand services, that's been created as we speak. It's not fast enough, it's not standard enough, but it is happening. It's definitely an evolution, not a revolution. But to take all of these services and to expose it, the providers are being forced to take that step towards your micro OSS.
I call that the new OSS. And in fact, in my opening slides this morning with my orchestrator of orchestrators picture, I didn't include it today, but the next step of that is that the OSS, BSS, and the orchestrator of orchestrators get combined. ONAP is a part of that, solves part of that picture. So, obviously Amdocs and Netcracker and ONAP and Ericsson, everybody's adding the capability to orchestrate, to deploy services over physical and virtual services. So they are evolving.
I think the challenge
but
is...
they're so complex. If you look at
yeah.
OSS and BSS, there's so many pieces to it. How do you, which parts do you evolve
yeah.
and which parts do you evolve first?
I think the challenge is, as we were discussing earlier, right? Because the data models don't exist, every time you deploy a service, if it's Nuage versus somebody else, you have to customize it. So there is a large professional services or system integration activity involved for each deployment. That is something I think that's unnecessary and wasted energy. That's what we got to work around.
But that's nice, but I think it'll always, we'll never get away from it. We can approach it.
Yes.
Right. I mean, Amdocs is 97% services
That's
revenue.
Right. That's right.
Netcracker is just getting over 50. They're still over 50%, well over 50%. And in the last 2 years, I've talked to a lot of operators and vendors. I've found no case yet where somebody's purchased NFV software or they did not also purchase integration services.
For sure. That's certainly
Zero,
the case.
I've found. There might be some out there, but we're not.
No, that's
we're
definitely
not
the
there
case.
yet. Yeah.
But the question is, can we improve that? Because
hopefully, yes. No, totally. That's the goal.
Sorry, for sure. I mean, I kind of agree with both of you in between, for sure, because here is the deal. Today, the networks are 95% legacy, for example, right? As operators start to migrate SD and NFV in a manner that has the technology, they get better technologies, virtualization is really stable. I'm talking about, the telecom operators, enterprise are already ahead. So we'll see for a foreseeable period of time, hybrid networks. That means you just cannot throw this 95%, right?
Yeah.
They're going to slowly reduce, but eventually it'll catch up. We can see the pure nirvana of single data model. Then you don't need to invest a lot of, OSS, BSS integrations. But eventually it will happen.
Yeah.
On the networking side as well, when we go back many years, we see that many of the protocols started proprietary. And then based on the customer pressure is really important here. When the customers, large customers like the ones that we have in the room here and otherwise, when they said, you guys need to interpret and you need to agree on the common model, then things happen. So it's really important. I mean, don't stop the innovation, but at the same time, apply the customer pressure to interpret and standardize on at least the protocol first. Like agree on if BGP is going to be the protocol, agree on that. If Yang or I don't know Tosca is going to be the data model, at least agree on the format. Then the next step is the rules within the format. So.